The most dangerous point in dealing with a narcissist isn't their anger, criticism, or even the moment they walk away in rage. It is the sudden silence that follows when it feels like you have been completely erased from their world. This kind of withdrawal often signals something final rather than temporary. They are not coming back to explain, repair, or continue the conflict. Most people only understand the meaning of that silence after everything has already ended. If you have ever sat in that emptiness and felt it hurt more than any argument, that moment often becomes a turning point in awareness. What collapses is not only the relationship itself, but also the illusion of what you believed it meant. That realization can be painful, but it also marks the beginning of clarity and emotional awakening. When a narcissist is truly done, there is rarely any dramatic ending, confrontation, or clear goodbye. The kind of loud discard people expect usually means there is still emotional engagement present. Real detachment is far quieter and far more unsettling. Messages stop being answered. Familiar patterns disappear and contact fades without explanation. You are left without closure because none is given. This absence pushes the mind into overthinking, trying to extract meaning from something that offers no response. It can lead to confusion and deep self-doubt, making you question your worth or whether the connection ever mattered. In reality, the silence is not a reflection of your value, but of their need to protect their self-image and avoid accountability. By disappearing without explanation, they reshape the story so it appears as if everything simply faded on its own rather than ending by choice. Emotional withdrawal from a narcissist is often more final than their anger, criticism, or even a dramatic discard, because anger still proves emotional involvement. When they are enraged, blaming, insulting, or punishing, there is still a thread of connection present. These reactions show that you still occupy space in their attention and still have the power to trigger a response. Even harmful behavior requires engagement. In that stage, you remain relevant within their emotional system. Detachment, however, signals something very different. It means you no longer register as emotionally significant. Your reactions no longer stimulate them, your silence does not provoke them, and your presence carries no emotional weight. This is not emotional growth, it is withdrawal of investment. The connection is shut down because it no longer provides value to them, leaving you outside their emotional field entirely. This kind of detachment is especially destabilizing because the nervous system is not designed to process relational silence without closure. Even painful interactions give the brain something to interpret, react to, and resolve. When those interactions stop entirely, the emotional bond does not immediately disappear. Instead, it lingers without resolution, creating a psychological gap that the mind tries to fill. You may find yourself replaying past conversations, searching for hidden meanings, or expecting a message that never comes. The absence of feedback becomes its own kind of pressure. While this internal struggle continues, the narcissist has already disengaged and moved on emotionally. Their lack of response is not confusion for them, but completion. This mismatch between your ongoing emotional processing and their emotional absence is what makes the experience feel so disorienting and mentally exhausting. Indifference is different from cruelty or manipulation because it removes emotional engagement entirely. Even negative behaviors like punishment, manipulation, or avoidance still indicate investment because they are directed actions. Indifference requires no effort, no reaction, and no emotional fuel. When a narcissist reaches true indifference, you are no longer part of their internal emotional landscape in any meaningful way. You are not someone to provoke, impress, or control. You simply stop mattering as an emotional variable. This is why it often feels so dehumanizing. Human beings naturally interpret connection through emotional feedback, even negative feedback. Without any response at all, there is no longer a signal that you exist in their emotional awareness. Communication, if it happens, becomes flat, distant, or purely functional. The emotional intensity that once defined the connection disappears completely, leaving behind a void rather than conflict or warmth. This stage often brings a deeper kind of grief than earlier abuse because it removes the emotional tension that once kept hope alive. Abuse, while painful, still suggests a connection in some form. Indifference removes that entirely, forcing you to face the possibility that the bond was never mutual in the way you experienced it. This can feel like emotional erasure, even though the relationship was real to you. For the narcissist, this detachment serves a protective function. By shutting down emotionally, they avoid guilt, shame, and accountability. It allows them to move forward without reflecting on harm caused. This is why seeking answers during this phase often increases suffering rather than resolving it. You are searching for meaning from someone who is no longer emotionally engaged. Understanding this does not erase the pain, but it can become the first step toward reclaiming your emotional clarity and stability. Narcissistic disengagement rarely happens because of sudden insight, emotional maturity, or genuine self-reflection. More often, the shift begins when a new source of validation has already entered the picture. This can be difficult to accept because it disrupts the comforting idea that silence or distance means reflection or regret. In many cases, their attention operates in a transactional pattern. When admiration, compliance, or emotional intensity decreases from one person, focus can quietly shift to another. The new connection does not need to be better or more meaningful, only new. Novelty itself creates stimulation, and a fresh person has not yet placed boundaries or disrupted their narrative. From the outside, the change feels abrupt, but the emotional withdrawal often starts long before it becomes visible. While you are still attempting to understand, repair, or reconnect, their investment may already be moving elsewhere, leaving you to experience the ending only once it has fully taken shape. During this stage, the emotional calm that follows can feel deeply unsettling because there is no visible struggle, conflict, or processing happening on their side. While you are still trying to make sense of the loss, they may appear unaffected, already redirecting their attention or forming a new connection. This transition is often not openly communicated, which intensifies the shock and confusion. If confronted, denial or minimization is common, since acknowledging the shift would expose patterns they prefer to keep hidden. At this point, trying to compete for attention or reestablish the bond often leads to further emotional strain because the dynamic is no longer operating in a reciprocal way. What once felt like a shared emotional space begins to function more like a system of replacement and substitution, where roles can be exchanged without explanation, leaving you to process a change that was never clearly acknowledged or explained. Closure is rarely provided in these situations because true closure requires accountability, and accountability threatens the self-protective image they maintain. To recognize the ending honestly would mean acknowledging emotional impact and responsibility, which many avoid in order to preserve internal stability. As a result, endings are often delivered through silence rather than direct communication. Messages are ignored, conversations are avoided, and interaction fades without explanation or resolution. This creates a suspended emotional experience where one person continues searching for meaning while the other has already detached internally. The mind naturally tries to fill this gap by replaying memories, reinterpreting moments, and imagining explanations that might bring clarity. However, the absence itself becomes the only consistent answer. While this understanding does not immediately remove the pain, it can gradually shift focus away from seeking closure from someone no longer engaged and toward rebuilding personal emotional grounding and stability. They are primarily focused on protecting themselves rather than supporting your healing process. Any explanation they offer is usually shaped by self-interest, selective memory, or distortion, and it often creates more confusion than clarity. Without a shared final conversation, the relationship does not end as one story, but splits into two separate versions. Theirs, which is simplified or rewritten, and yours, which is left full of unanswered questions. This lack of a common narrative removes the emotional reference point people rely on to make sense of loss, which is why the experience can feel unreal, destabilizing, and deeply disorienting. In that absence, the mind naturally searches for meaning that can no longer be obtained from them. Accepting that closure will not come externally is painful, but it is necessary. Their silence is not a mystery to decode. It is the final expression of the dynamic. The clarity you need has to be constructed within you, not extracted from them. When these relationships end, they rarely follow the structure people associate with healthy emotional closure. There is usually no gradual distancing, no honest discussion, and no mutual understanding of what is happening. Instead, the shift often feels sudden and fragmented, as if two realities are colliding, the intensity that once existed and the emptiness that follows. This becomes even more confusing because the connection was often unstable from the beginning, alternating between closeness, validation, and withdrawal. Over time, your nervous system adapts to that unpredictability and becomes highly sensitive to any change in tone, attention, or emotional availability. You learn to adjust, repair, and re-engage whenever disconnection appears. When contact suddenly stops, that internal system does not immediately settle. It continues expecting signals that no longer arrive, creating ongoing tension, uncertainty, and self-questioning, even in complete silence. The imbalance becomes clearer with distance and reflection. One person is left trying to mentally complete an unfinished emotional story, while the other has already disengaged and moved forward internally. This gap creates significant confusion, especially when silence replaces interaction, because the mind is still operating on patterns that assume emotional reciprocity exists. Without responses to interpret, attention turns inward and begins constructing meaning from absence itself. This is often mistaken for unresolved attachment, when in reality, it is the residue of conditioning shaped by inconsistency. You were trained to respond, adjust, and restore connection, so the lack of engagement feels like something incomplete. But clarity becomes difficult when the original bond was not built on stable mutual exchange. Recognizing this allows the focus to shift away from decoding their silence and toward rebuilding your own internal sense of clarity and grounding. What makes this kind of ending so psychologically intense is that it doesn't just remove a person from your life. It removes the structure your mind was using to understand the relationship. When a connection has been built on inconsistency, your brain doesn't organize it as a clean memory. It organizes it as a pattern of pursuit, repair, relief, and then loss again. Over time, that cycle conditions your attention to stay alert for emotional shifts because unpredictability becomes normal. So when the connection suddenly stops, your nervous system doesn't interpret it as it's over and safe now. It interprets it as something is missing and I need to fix it. That's why silence can feel louder than conflict. Conflict still gives direction. Silence removes it. Another layer is that the mind tends to hold on to intermittent reinforcement much more strongly than steady connection. Moments of closeness, affection, or validation become emotionally overweighted because they stand out against the instability. These peak moments get stored as emotionally significant reference points, even if they were brief or conditional. So when the relationship ends, your memory doesn't just replay the ending. It replays the highs, searching for consistency that never actually existed in a stable form. This creates a kind of internal contradiction where your emotional memory insists something meaningful happened, but the present reality offers no continuation of it. What deepens the confusion even further is that there is often no final signal your mind can latch onto. In healthy endings, there is usually some form of closure, even if painful, that allows the brain to categorize the experience as complete. Here, the lack of explanation forces your mind into open loops. Open loops are mentally expensive because the brain keeps trying to resolve them automatically. That's why you may find yourself revisiting conversations, rereading messages, or reconstructing timelines, not because you are stuck on the person, but because your cognition is trying to finish a story that was interrupted without resolution. At the same time, emotional withdrawal from the other side can create a distorted mirror effect. When one person goes emotionally flat or absent, the other often fills that emptiness with self-blame. The mind prefers, I caused this, over there is no explanation, because blame at least creates a sense of control. But that sense of control is false and painful. It turns uncertainty into self-criticism, even when the change had more to do with their internal pattern of disengagement than anything you did in the moment. Over time, healing starts to shift when the focus moves away from decoding their behavior and toward observing your own nervous system response. The anxiety, the rumination, the urge to re-engage, and the need for answers are not signs that you still need them emotionally. They are signs that your system is unwinding from unpredictability. As that settles, the emotional charge slowly reduces, not because you received answers from them, but because your brain stops treating silence as something that needs to be solved. Eventually, what remains is not clarity about their intentions, but clarity about your experience. You begin to see how deeply you adapted, how much energy was spent trying to stabilize something unstable, and how your attention was shaped by inconsistency. That realization can feel uncomfortable, but it is also where the shift happens. Because once your mind stops expecting resolution from the other side, it starts reclaiming its ability to generate stability internally instead of chasing it externally. As that internal shift continues, one of the most important realizations is that your emotional system was not reacting to a single event, but to a prolonged pattern of unpredictability. When connection, distance, warmth, and withdrawal alternate repeatedly, the nervous system starts treating the relationship as something it must constantly manage. This creates a state of emotional vigilance where you are not just experiencing the relationship, you are monitoring it. Even after it ends, that monitoring habit doesn't disappear instantly. It continues automatically, scanning for meaning, updates, or resolution that never arrives. This is also why people often describe feeling stuck, even when they intellectually understand the situation is over. The logical mind can accept absence, but the emotional system takes longer to update. It still behaves as if re-engagement is possible, because in the past, inconsistency meant there was always a chance of return, repair, or sudden reconnection. So silence doesn't register as finality right away. It registers as uncertainty, and uncertainty keeps attention activated. Another difficult part of this experience is how it can distort self-perception. When communication disappears without explanation, the mind often fills the gap by turning inward and reviewing itself. You may start analyzing what you said, what you did, what you missed, or what you could have done differently. This creates the illusion that understanding the ending depends on finding the mistake that caused it. But in dynamics shaped by emotional inconsistency, endings are rarely caused by one specific moment. They are usually the result of shifting internal priorities on the other side, which were never fully communicated or shared. Over time, this can lead to emotional over-responsibility, where you carry more psychological weight than is actually yours. You become the interpreter of silence, trying to assign meaning to something that was never clearly expressed. This role feels active, like you are solving something, but in reality, it keeps you emotionally tied to an experience that has already ended externally. Healing begins to deepen when the focus gradually moves away from interpretation and toward observation. Instead of asking what the silence means about them, the attention slowly shifts to what the silence is doing within you. That includes noticing patterns like rumination, urgency for answers, or emotional spikes when remembering certain moments. These reactions are not evidence of ongoing attachment to the person as they were. They are evidence of your system recalibrating after prolonged uncertainty. With enough time and distance, the emotional charge of unanswered questions begins to fade, not because they are resolved, but because they lose their power to activate you. What once felt like a need for explanation starts to feel more like a memory of confusion rather than a present emergency. And in that shift, something important happens. Your sense of stability stops depending on external clarity and starts rebuilding from internal grounding instead. As this process continues, another layer becomes clearer. The mind was not only attached to the person, but also to the emotional pattern they created. That pattern often included anticipation, uncertainty, brief relief, and then loss again. Over time, your brain starts to recognize that cycle as familiar, even if it was painful. Familiarity can feel like attachment because the nervous system prefers known patterns over unknown emptiness. So when the relationship ends, it is not just the person you are adjusting to losing, it is the entire rhythm your mind became conditioned to expect. This is why periods of silence after the ending can feel strangely intense. Without the usual emotional highs and lows, your system loses its reference points. Even distress can feel stabilizing if it is predictable. So when everything suddenly goes quiet, your mind can interpret that stillness as unfamiliar and therefore unsafe. That is what drives the urge to check, revisit, or mentally re-enter the situation, even when you consciously know there is nothing new to find. Another important shift happens when you begin to recognize how much emotional energy was spent trying to interpret inconsistency as meaning. In the moment, every shift in tone or behavior feels significant, like it contains hidden information you need to decode. But with distance, it becomes clearer that inconsistency does not always contain meaning. Sometimes it is simply inconsistency. The effort to constantly interpret it can leave you emotionally exhausted, because you are effectively trying to build stability out of instability. As this realization deepens, self-blame often starts to lose its grip. The mind gradually sees that it was responding logically to an emotionally confusing environment. You are not overthinking for no reason. You are trying to create coherence in a situation that did not offer it consistently. That reframes your experience from personal failure into adaptive survival within emotional uncertainty. Over time, the focus shifts again, this time from understanding them to understanding your own internal responses. You start noticing how your body reacts to reminders, silence, or certain memories. Instead of analyzing what they meant, you begin observing what happens inside you when you think about it. That change is subtle, but it is powerful because it moves you out of their emotional system and back into your own. Eventually, the intensity of the bond begins to weaken not because the memories disappear, but because they stop triggering the same level of activation. The mind no longer treats the past as something unresolved in the present. It becomes something complete, even if it was never fully explained. And in that quiet completion, space slowly opens for emotional stability that is no longer dependent on answers that were never given. As that space opens, something very subtle but important starts to happen. Your attention stops automatically returning to them and begins returning to you. At first, this shift is unstable. You may still have waves of curiosity, emotional flashes, or moments where the mind tries to reopen the story. But those moments become less like urgent signals and more like passing echoes. The difference is that they no longer fully pull you back into the emotional system that kept you stuck. This is often where people notice a strange mix of relief and emptiness at the same time. Relief comes from no longer being in the cycle of confusion and emotional guessing. Emptiness appears because the mind is used to intensity, even when that intensity was painful. When a high stimulation emotional pattern ends, the nervous system can temporarily interpret calm as unfamiliar. So part of what feels like missing them is actually the absence of emotional volatility your system had adapted to. With continued distance, your perspective on the relationship starts to reorganize itself. Instead of remembering it as a single emotional experience, you begin to see it as a sequence of patterns. You notice how attention, distance, intensity, and withdrawal were distributed unevenly. That recognition reduces the tendency to personalize everything because it becomes clearer that much of what happened followed a pattern that existed independently of your actions or explanations. At the same time, your internal dialogue begins to soften. The need to find the exact reason, the exact moment, or the exact mistake slowly weakens. This is an important stage because it marks the reduction of self-interrogation. You stop treating your memory like a courtroom where you must constantly defend or explain yourself. Instead, it becomes more like a record of experience that no longer requires ongoing judgment. Another shift happens in how you relate to silence itself. What once felt loaded and meaningful begins to feel neutral. Silence stops being a message you must decode and starts becoming simply absence of interaction. That change may seem small, but psychologically it is significant because it removes the emotional charge from something that previously kept you activated. Over time, the most profound change is not that you forget, but that you no longer need the same story to make sense of what happened. The emotional system stops demanding closure from the outside because it has gradually learned to tolerate uncertainty without collapsing into it. And in that tolerance, a different kind of stability forms, one that is not dependent on explanation, but on your ability to remain grounded even when explanation never arrives. At a deeper level, this stage is also where your identity starts to separate from the relationship experience itself. When a bond is emotionally intense and inconsistent, it can quietly become part of how you see yourself, not just something that happened to you. You may notice that certain thoughts, reactions, or expectations were shaped around that dynamic, especially the habit of scanning for emotional shifts or trying to predict changes in connection. As that influence fades, you begin to notice parts of yourself that were not centered around managing that uncertainty. This is not an immediate or dramatic shift. It often happens in very small moments where you realize you are not thinking about them first thing in the morning, or you go longer periods without emotional spikes tied to memories. Those gaps of neutrality are important because they show that your nervous system is no longer constantly orienting itself around the relationship. Instead, attention slowly redistributes back into ordinary life, even if at first it feels unfamiliar or slightly empty. Another important development is the reduction of internal urgency. Early on, the mind often treats the situation like something still open, something that needs solving or understanding. That urgency creates mental pressure, as if clarity is just one insight away. But over time, that pressure begins to dissolve. You start to see that not everything unresolved is meant to be solved through thinking. Some experiences only settle when emotional activation decreases, not when answers are found. As this understanding deepens, the emotional weight of the past begins to shift. Instead of feeling like an active problem, it becomes more like a closed experience that still has emotional residue, but no longer requires action. This is where acceptance starts to form, not as agreement with what happened, but as the end of resistance toward needing it to be different. You may also notice that your interpretation of silence changes significantly. What once felt like abandonment, rejection, or hidden meaning becomes less loaded. Silence stops functioning as a signal about your worth or importance and becomes just a lack of contact. This is a crucial internal correction because it breaks the automatic link between external behavior and internal value. Eventually, what replaces the constant search for explanation is a quieter kind of awareness. You begin to understand that your healing was never dependent on their clarity, apology, or return. It was dependent on your nervous system learning that it does not need to stay activated in the absence of resolution. And once that lesson is integrated, the past no longer feels like something pulling you backward, but something that has already been metabolized into understanding.